Today is March 12th, and this is William Michael of the Classical Liberal Arts Academy. I haven't posted any talks for some time now, at least a week, maybe 2 weeks, because I've had a cold and just haven't been feeling well, and I've had to make sure I save my energy for my necessary work every day. And over these 2 weeks, I've received a lot of feedback from past talks and a couple of interesting questions. And one of the questions that I was asked was whether or not I believe that the United States sent a mission that landed on the moon, whether I believe in the moon landing. And I thought that was an interesting question because it's really something I never think about. But as I thought about the question, what I think about the moon landing, whether I believe in the moon landing or not, I realized that there are other deeper questions, I think, that are behind that question that need to be discussed. And I'd like to make a short talk, as I'm still not feeling 100% yet. I'd like to talk a little bit about that question and what questions I think lie behind the surface, or beneath the surface, I should say, that we need to consider when we talk about a controversial subject like whether men landed on the moon or not. Now, for most people in the modern world, for most Americans especially, it's taken for granted that we did, in fact, send men to the moon. There are a small number of people who question whether the event was real or not, and they have reasons for saying so. The same kind of reasons that people have for believing that the earth is flat. And while these views are unpopular, they're often scoffed at. But one of the things I don't like about that scoffing is that the people who scoff at those who have unpopular opinions on controversial issues rarely see the reality that they fail to persuade people. Their arguments, the reasons why they give to justify their own judgments, are not persuasive. And that's one of the reasons people doubt and are open to other views. So the scoffers imagine themselves to be so clever. But even if I play devil's advocate and take up some of these unpopular positions in discussions, I rarely find that the people who represent the popular opinion actually are able to explain why they claim to believe in this or that. And that's one of the reasons why these unpopular views are held by people, and they're held with some serious conviction. Now, this question of the moon landing, just to start off, it seems that men landed on the moon because there is video of astronauts on the moon. There's video of men landing on the moon. So it would seem like men have indeed landed on the moon. And for many, that video is the proof. They've seen those videos. They've seen images of men bouncing around on the surface of the moon, and they've concluded that it happened, and there's the proof. They also consider that it must have been true because making up something like that at the government level, at the national level, would just be so insane. How completely insane would it be for the government to lie about something like sending people to the moon? It seems almost too ridiculous to be a lie. And so I think those are the two main main reasons why most people accept the truth of the moon landing pretty easily. I mean, I've rarely even thought about it. But that leads me to the underlying questions that I think are more important. Now, the first thing that I'd like to say is there are many controversial questions that are simply none of our business. And this question of the moon landing may be one of them. I personally have no interest in this question either way. I don't care. It really has no significance philosophically. If it was really that important, we would go back there. We would have all kind of projects going on the moon if it was really important. And yet we don't see any interest in returning to the moon. And if you consider that our government claims to have the ability to send men to the moon, you would think that as exciting and fascinating as that may be, we would do something with that capability if it was significant. But it appears not to be significant. And so the first question I think we always have to ask ourselves is, before we get into any of these controversial questions, is it any of our business? Does it even matter? Because if it's not significant, we need to learn to just ignore certain questions. And for most people, I think this is a question that really isn't significant. I personally don't care either way. I'm not going to spend tons of time looking into it, or because I just don't care. And I don't think that there's going to be conclusive evidence on either side that demonstrates and takes away all doubt. So it's just not a significant issue. That's issue number one. Are we digging into controversial questions that are simply none of our business? Second, what's at the heart of this is a distrust of the government. The second thing to consider is, why would anyone distrust the government? And so this question has nothing to do with evidence, because we all know that evidence can be doctored. Videos, photos, everything can be doctored. So these things aren't really demonstrative sources of proof for anything. The real question is, would it be possible that our government, for some reason, would be motivated to lie to the people? Do we believe that our government would ever lie to us? And I think that's the key issue here. Many people in America believe that our government would lie to us. And we have a very interesting case study in the present situation between Russia and Ukraine. I found this personally fascinating. I was raised in this modern anti-Russia or I guess it would be Russophobic culture, where I remember as a kid being taught that Russia was bad and America was good. I remember in my 4th grade class learning about Ronald Reagan and Mikhail Gorbachev, and how America was fighting for freedom for all people and democracy through the world, and Russia was trying to oppress people and deny them freedoms that we enjoy in America. And I know I had that pounded into my head as a 4th grader in history class. I grew up imagining that people in Russia are poor. They have to wait in line for their bread. They're not allowed to do anything. They have no idea what's going on. The government keeps everything secret from them. And they live this miserable, slave-like life, just serving the people in power who get wealthy off of their work and service. And the people in Russia never understand what they're doing, and the people in power are eager to try to destroy America and spread their way of life through the whole world. That was my image of Russia as a kid. And in this recent war with Ukraine, that message still remains. It's still the popular American message. And as this war with Ukraine gets started, we're listening to the American media, CNN, Fox News, Reuters News, and so on. And we're told stories like Russia blocks Facebook, Russia blocks Google, Russia blocks YouTube, Russia blocks Twitter. And we're led to think that the Russians, because they're evil, don't want the good people who live in Russia to learn the truth. So what they do is they actually control all media, even the internet, and only let the Russian people learn what they want them to think is true. And we're told that's what Russia does, because Russia is evil and they lie about everything they do. Now we're told about this censorship in Russia because it's supposedly bad. They blocked Facebook, they blocked YouTube, they blocked Twitter, they block many American news sources. The people in Russia can't hear certain points of view, can't hear other perspectives. This is evil. In America, we believe in the freedom of speech. But that's just what we're told. You can turn right around and look up on the internet and learn that YouTube is blocking Russian news sites. Twitter is blocking Russian information sources. And so we have no way of actually hearing any perspective except for the pro-American, anti-Russian perspective that's on the American news channels. We can't hear the Russian side of the story. We can't watch a video and listen to Vladimir Putin explain what he's doing, or any of his ministers talk about what's going on in Ukraine from the Russian perspective. We're not allowed to hear their side of the story. When they prevent the Russian people from hearing the American side of the story, we call it oppression and censorship. But the American media does the exact same thing, and somehow we see it as freedom. It's something different from what they're doing. When we block their news sources, it's because we're punishing them. We're showing them who's in control. But when they block their news sources, it's oppression and censorship. It's injustice and tyranny. America does the same thing. And so we see very clearly this double standard. We see very clearly that Russia is criticized for things, and our government, our country, does the same things. And so we can see that there's no question that there's dishonesty in government. We could say that this is just part of military activity. There's a need for privacy. There's a need for deception with regard to your enemies. But that deception extends to the people. And we know, for example, this is supposed to be a government by the people and for the people, yet there's so-called classified information that the people aren't allowed to know about. If the government is by the people and for the people, how in the world can information be blocked from the people? Doesn't make much sense. And why would the government tell us one thing and yet not let us see classified information? Now, I'm not saying anything negative about this. I'm not complaining. I'm just saying it's pretty clear that our government is not consistent and transparent in all of its communication with the people. And so if we were going to ask, is it possible that our government would carry out some information warfare during the Cold War against Russia and present an appearance that we have successfully landed on the moon for some appearance of superior technological power that the Russians would then realize that they don't have, and maybe that would intimidate them and cause them to back down because they would see that our capabilities were so much greater than theirs, and that this would influence them and affect their decisions. Could something like this be staged for the sake of winning the Cold War? That's a question I think is worth debating. Would the government just lie about the moon landing, just for the fun of it? No, that's ridiculous. But could there be some reason why the government would think that an appearance of superior technological capability and progress would be effective in influencing Russia's decisions during the Cold War? Maybe. And so I wouldn't make a decision either way. Again, I would say I have no way of knowing the truth of something like this. There's no way that it can be proven to me demonstratively. None of my life decisions are going to be dependent on whether or not men landed on the moon, and so I really don't care either way. But there are people who go a step further and they say, no, our government is intentionally deceiving us for all of these different reasons. And we get into all sorts of conspiracy theories. Theories that people are using our government to try to accomplish some deeper, invisible ends, some global conspiracies where the American democracy is being used to take American tax money to fund global operations. There's all kinds of conspiracy theories, and while, again, I don't really pay much attention to that stuff, I tend to keep my eyes focused on my own life and daily responsibilities. I can see why people are willing to listen to those ideas and consider those theories to be possibly true. They don't do so with any demonstration or proof, so again, neither side really has any conclusive evidence. They just go back and forth in disagreement without any resolution. But I can understand, especially when people have bad personal experiences. For example, I was once falsely arrested. And this did not happen when I was a teenager or in college. This happened last year. I called the police to report something that happened to my family. And for some crazy reason, a police officer that came out to take a police report from me decided that I was lying and arrested me, physically arrested me, and brought me to the county jail, accused of filing a false police report. My wife watched as this happened. My kids watched as this happened. My parents watched as this happened. And I can see, based on that experience, that crazy, inexplicable experience where I think what happened was that I uncovered some corruption in the police force with regard to a certain towing company. But that experience was so crazy and impossible to comprehend, impossible to make sense out of, that I could see why people who have bad experiences much worse and much more significant than that, those charges were dismissed and it was just ridiculous. But I can see why people who have more serious experiences that produce lasting effects, maybe even life-changing effects, can never get over that. I could understand that. I could understand why soldiers, veterans might feel like that based on things they've experienced. I can imagine that people have had really terrible experiences with corrupt individuals that they can never get over. So I understand. I can understand because, like I said, I've experienced some government craziness myself. Now, having said that, though, the problem that I have with all this conspiracy theory stuff is that there is no demonstrative evidence on either side. And so, as one who doesn't have some personal motive to prove one side or the other, or to believe one side of the other, I tend to ignore these conspiracy theories. And just like I said, focus on my own life responsibilities. But I can understand why people entertain those ideas. People have had traumatic experiences with the government, and overcoming those experiences and trusting the government may be impossible for them. And so considering something like the moon landing, they may be absolutely convinced that the government would lie about something like that for whatever reason they may have. But the third issue that I want to talk about, and I think this is the most important, this is what really made me willing to take up this question, because I'm not going to actually get into the discussion of whether there was a moon landing. I mean, there's no way that I could prove that either way. And all I would be doing is recycling things that have already been said elsewhere by people with more information than I have. But there is an important issue that I would like to discuss, and it's the issue of faith. For most people, they grow up in a secular life, and then at some point they have a conversion experience and they become Christians. And when they become Christians, all of a sudden, they start talking about this topic of faith. This word faith enters into their daily vocabulary, and the word faith is associated in their minds with Christianity. But the problem is that faith really has nothing to do essentially with Christianity. Faith is a simple concept. And it's important for us to understand what faith is. Now, there are two different kinds of knowledge that we can have. We can have certainty, where something is known to us demonstratively. And demonstration can happen in a couple of different ways. First of all, by a demonstrative argument, where we reason from some universal and known truth to a conclusion that we can be sure is absolutely certain because it's deduced from a premise or two premises that are absolutely certain. That's demonstration. When we know something demonstratively, we can be absolutely certain of it. We can also be certain of something when we experience it for ourselves, when it's demonstrated to us, to our senses, as it were. Like if I were to say that snow is white and then take a person out into the snow and let them see that it's white, that would be another kind of demonstration. Not the same kind, but a different kind. But when we have something demonstrated to us, we can be absolutely certain about it. Anytime something is presented to us that is not demonstrated, we cannot be absolutely certain about it. And so we have to choose to either receive that message or reject it. We choose to receive it or reject it. If we choose to receive it with no demonstrative evidence, we do on the basis of probability. We think that it probably is true. That's what faith is. So for example, if my wife comes in and tells me dinner's ready, and it's around 6 o'clock in the evening, I don't think my wife is playing a trick on me or lying when she comes to tell me that dinner's ready. And so I'll get out of my office and go out to the dining room by faith. I trust that what my wife told me is true based on probability, based on the fact that I don't think she would do this and play a trick on me. The time is appropriate for dinner and so on. I have reason to believe that this is probably true, and I respond by faith. That's all that faith is. It's when we respond to something based on probability. When we accept something based on probability. I could also choose to reject it. For example, if she came in with a weird smirk on her face and it was 2 o'clock in the afternoon and she said dinner's ready, I would sit and look at her and say, "What are you talking about? It's only 2 o'clock." I wouldn't receive her message by faith. I would doubt it. And she would have to give me more reason to believe that dinner was ready at 2 o'clock. And if she didn't, I would continue to doubt it and tell her to leave me alone unless she had something really to prove. But that's the difference between faith and doubt. These are based on probability. There's no demonstration. We're asked to accept something that cannot be demonstrated to us, either by reason or by observation. And we're asked to receive it by faith. And we have no reason to receive anything by faith, especially from men, especially on topics that are really insignificant. Now, if someone comes to me and talks about the moon landing, I'm the type of person who is very hesitant to make a judgment on anything. I really don't trust anyone, not in a negative way, not that I believe anyone is untrustworthy. But I don't trust anything anyone tells me because I try as hard as I can to always reserve judgment and allow myself to make decisions based on only what I am absolutely certain is true. That's one of the keys to making good decisions, to weed out from the information in our minds any information that isn't absolutely certain, and make decisions based on what is absolutely certain and known. That's what a wise man does. And so I work to never ever receive any testimony or any message from any person unless it's at least probable. And so I'll ask for more information or more evidence, or I'll simply refuse to make a decision because I don't see any reason to accept what I'm told. That's why this issue of the moon landing will really never make it into my brain, because I just don't believe either way that it could be presented to me demonstratively. If all that I have is a video, video may produce probability, but knowing how easily alterable videos are, video evidence can never be demonstrative. Probable, maybe, but never demonstrative. The same is true of photos or anything else. I will never have demonstrative evidence that men landed on the moon. And at the same time, I don't believe that I will ever have demonstrative evidence that men did not land on the moon. I don't believe I will ever have demonstrative evidence that the government lied about men landing on the moon. I could have some probable evidence that there was reason for the government to lie about the moon landing, but it won't be demonstrative. And so if I was a judge in a court or a juror, I would never vote guilty that the government lied because I would never have demonstrative evidence. I don't believe that any such evidence exists. And so what this really comes down to is a statement made by our government, by NASA, that they have successfully landed on the moon. It's a statement that is accompanied with several sources of evidence, none of which are demonstrative, yet probable. Then there is an accusation that the government is actually lying, and that accusation comes with no demonstrative evidence, but some evidence that may be probable. And that's what this discussion is really about. The message of the government that men landed on the moon with some probable evidence, and the accusation that the government is lying with some probable evidence. And for neither of these two issues is demonstration available to us, and therefore no certain judgment can be made. And so the question I ask is, why are people trying to make a certain decision or judgment on this issue when no such judgment can be made? That's what this ultimately comes down to. Why are people trying to force others to take a position and make a judgment on these issues? And this is presented as a dilemma. You've got to pick one side or the other. Either men landed on the moon or the government lied. But that's really not the decision that's before us. There's two different questions, as I said. It's not one question with two alternatives. It's whether men landed on the moon or not. The government says men landed on the moon, and it furnishes probable evidence. I don't have to make a decision without demonstrative evidence, and so I don't have to answer that question. Then there's an accusation, as I said, that the government lied and men did not land on the moon. And again, that's accompanied with probable evidence, and I do not need to make any decision on that question because there's no demonstration. And so I believe that the proper response to both of these questions is to simply not answer, to say there's not sufficient proof either way. But I can't affirm or deny the statements. I don't make a judgment. I reserve judgment. And this is something that for some reason we feel like we're not allowed to do in modern society. We feel like we're not allowed to simply reserve judgment and say, I don't know. I don't have evidence that allows me to say yes or no to this question, and therefore I simply will not judge. I mean, a judge in a court case doesn't just decide innocent or guilty. He can also dismiss the case and refuse to judge. And we can do the same thing. There are many cases presented to us that simply need to be dismissed. We need to learn to dismiss many of these controversies because there's no resolution. And that's true of the moon landing. There's no evidence that will demonstrate either side of either question, and therefore the issue simply has to be dismissed. If I dismiss the government's assertion that they landed on the moon, I am not acknowledging that the government may lie. I'm not making any judgment. I'm not making a judgment. I'm refusing to make a judgment. And we have to learn that that's an acceptable option whenever we're asked questions. Remember, if you've seen the movie A Man for All Seasons, remember Thomas More decided to simply remain quiet on the question of the king's oath of supremacy. He chose to be quiet, and they tried to accuse him of saying something by his silence, and Thomas More made it clear that he was not saying anything by his silence. He was saying nothing. And we see how that makes people uncomfortable, but that's the right response to many issues. And it doesn't matter what people make of our responses. They can say, oh, well, that proves that. They can say whatever they want. They're not right. But we have the freedom to simply reserve judgment and be quiet. That's why a person who's accused of a crime has a right to plead the fifth and just not answer questions. Because after all, if you're accusing me of a crime, you're supposed to have the evidence. You don't have to come asking me questions to try and find the evidence. If you've accused me of a crime, you're supposed to have the evidence. Therefore, I don't have to contribute to your investigation when you've already accused me of a crime. If you're looking for evidence, then how can you accuse me? That's why a suspect has the right to not answer questions, to plead the Fifth Amendment and be quiet. And likewise, in many of these popular issues, we need to learn to reserve judgment and not say anything. It may turn out that more information becomes available. It may turn out that more evidence is available, and even some demonstrative evidence. It may happen in our life that we do have to make a decision on one of these questions for some other reason. And when those times come, if those times come, we have to make the best decision we can based on the evidence that's available. But for most of us, there's no need to answer these questions or fight with people as if we actually know, as if our probable evidence is actual demonstrative evidence, because it's not. At best, we have probable evidence, and we need to acknowledge that. Now, the more important issue, I think, let's say the first issue was, if the government asserts that men landed on the moon, we can choose to believe their testimony or reserve judgment. If we deny that statement, then we are affirming this. Maybe not. If we deny the government's assertion that men have landed on the moon, it may appear that we're asserting or affirming that the government is lying. But we may be affirming simply that the government is wrong for some reason or in some way. But we're not necessarily accusing the government of lying, unless they argue that it's demonstratively certain that men landed on the moon. And then to deny them would be to accuse them of lying. And they would be lying because there is no demonstrative evidence. They would be lying. Unless, of course, objects were brought back from the moon. And then we'd have to ask how would they be identified and whether demonstrative evidence was available to prove that the things obtained were actually from the moon. And you see how this just goes on and on and on. Demonstrative evidence is very difficult to obtain. But the second issue of accusing the government of lying and having no demonstrative evidence to prove that the government is lying, I think is the weaker of the two positions. For the government to say that men landed on the moon is one thing. To accuse the government of lying with no demonstrative evidence would fail in a court. It would fail if brought to trial. The government would be assumed or presumed to be innocent of lying unless proven guilty. And how would someone prove that the government in fact lied about the moon landing? So if I was to take a position, I believe that I could never take the position and affirm that the government lied with no demonstrative evidence. So that position, that would be unjust, in my opinion. I couldn't take that position. And if I was to accept the fact that the government affirmed that there was a moon landing and presents probable evidence, I think that's a more tenable position to take than the other. But as I said, I'm also free to reserve judgment. And I would likely do so in both cases because to me, it doesn't matter whether either is true or false. But without demonstrative evidence, the moral accusation that the government lied is a false accusation without proof. And so if there's no demonstrative evidence, it's actually evil to argue that someone lied when we can't prove it. So I would be careful if I was going to take that position that I had demonstrative evidence, because that's evil to falsely accuse someone of lying, of bearing false witness, which is grave moral evil, especially at that level. It would take an unjust person to be willing to go forward with accusations with no demonstrative evidence. And how many people who say these things have any such evidence? That's pretty ridiculous. So I would be more concerned with someone embracing the argument that the government lied than with someone embracing the government's assertion that men landed on the moon. And so morally, I think that believing in the moon landing is a safer choice. But that's that. And I hope that discussion about faith, what faith is, makes things clearer. And I also hope that we see the danger of these apparent contradictories, because they're not really contradictories. They're two different statements. One is the government affirming that men landed on the moon. Another is that the government is lying. Those are two very different things. And if someone doesn't have demonstrative evidence that the government lied, that's a false accusation. So I would be very careful of embracing that position or any such position where you're accusing someone of lying. That's evil. And if you have no proof, that's what a false accusation is. And that's forbidden by the Ten Commandments. So that's a serious problem. And I think we need to stick to the original argument, which is that the government has affirmed that men have landed on the moon. And we're free to accept that or to reserve judgment or deny it. But the other issue that creeps in, I think, is morally evil and needs to be avoided. So anyway, I hope that's helpful, at least to consider how I would approach the question of the moon landing. Unless someone has demonstrative evidence that they'd like to share, I'd be happy to check it out. But as far as I know, all evidence is at best probable, and I really choose on that issue to reserve judgment with regard to the issue itself, not because I doubt the government, but simply because I don't have evidence, and it's not a necessary decision for me. But I certainly avoid any accusation that the government lied when there's no evidence for that. I hope that's helpful. God bless.